has also held the positions of Economic Advisor and Additional Secretary to the Prime Minister, Additional Secretary at the Department of Economic Affairs, and Senior Environment Specialist at the Asian Development Bank, Manila. He was a member of India's team at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations. Welcome, Dr. Ghosh. Our first speaker is a legal luminary, Ms. Farishte Setna, a founder partner of DMD and managing partner of DMD Mumbai. She specializes in legal disputes over more than 3 decades across multiple jurisdictions in diverse industries, spanning the UK, US, Singapore, United Arab Emirates, Australia, Canada, Indonesia, Africa, among others. In arbitration, her expertise encompasses the areas of foreign investment and the environment. She has successfully represented global majors in billion-dollar litigation, culminating in landmark judgments from the Supreme Court of India to The Hague. She is a member of the Supreme Court Bar Association in India, fellow of the Indian Council of Arbitration, and ranked by accredited international entities in A-list Top 100 Lawyers of India. Welcome, Ms. Setna. The final speaker is Dr. Ningto Jam Koremba Singh, Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Delhi. Dr. Singh specializes in environmental security. He has previously served as Assistant Professor in the Department of International Relations, Sikkim Central University, India, and in the faculty of MS University, Baroda, teaching international relations theory with special reference to contemporary international relations in environment, green politics, and human rights. Welcome, Dr. Singh. I will now hand over the session to the chairperson to deliver his own address and to conduct the proceedings.
Good afternoon, and I think the conference is running way behind schedule. Good afternoon, and since we are running way behind schedule, I think we will try and be parsimonious with time in this particular session. We have 2 distinguished speakers in this panel. Who have already been introduced by the organizers. So let me begin by thanking the organizers, Ambassador Moses, Nisha Ramdas, for giving me and the other speakers the opportunity to speak at this very important dialogue. I would like to dedicate this session to Ambassador Chandrasekhar Das Gupta, who passed away earlier this month and who was the principal architect of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the bedrock of the global climate change regime, and with whom I have had a long and fruitful partnership in the climate change negotiations and later as policy researchers at TERI. So, now, before I give the floor to the other speakers, here is my take on this topic, as TV anchors are apt to say. My first point is that the premise of the session is that India somehow seems to lack an adequate legal framework for climate change and sustainable development, and also that there is none or an inadequate mechanism for oversight of implementation of climate change policies and measures. Well, let me submit that I do not believe that this is the case. Of course, the other speakers in this panel may have their own views on this question. So let me begin by trying and explaining the structure of public actions Well, primarily we are talking of the domestic policy regime. We are not talking of international relations. We are certainly not talking of military or defense strategy here. So at the apex, we have the Constitution, and the Constitution lays down guide rails for all players in the economy to follow, and also through the directive principles, it provides a list of policy objectives that the state and society generally must strive to accomplish. Within the four corners of the Constitution, the government is enabled to make policies on various things: health, education, social welfare, environment, energy, housing, you name it. But what exactly is the policy about? The policy is about that in that particular domain, what are the objectives that the government intends to follow? What are the instruments and resources that would be brought to bear in accomplishing these objectives? And these instruments typically consist of laws, regulations which are themselves based on the laws, and fiscal provisions, to be spent in terms of what defined budget lines. In India we tend to call them schemes. And of course, there is also the mechanism for oversight and implementation of each of these actions. Now, Indian climate change policy is contained primarily in the 10 missions of the National Action Plan on Climate Change. And for better or for worse, I had some hand in drafting the NAPCC when it was first adopted in 2008. Now, the anticipated outcomes of the National Action on Climate Change are what feed into India's NDCs under the Paris Agreement. Now, these 10 missions, and I'm not going to give you a laundry list of these 10 missions. Some of them require legislation, several of them require regulation, some of them require fiscal provision, many of them require fiscal provision, and some of them require a combination of these. Now, what are the legal provisions that we have for the implementation of the NAPCC? We have a plethora of acts. We have the Energy Conservation Act, the Forest Conservation Act, the Biodiversity Conservation Act, the Water Act, the Environmental Protection Act, the Air Act, and so on. Now, in some cases, of course, the regulations may have to be enacted under these respective acts. For example, if we wish to implement a domestic carbon market, we would have to adopt regulations under the Energy Conservation Act. If we wish to go beyond the energy sector in regulating greenhouse gases and creating a wider carbon market, we can do that under regulations under the Environment Protection Act. So I would submit that the legal framework certainly exists, and for specific actions under the national missions, the space exists for adopting regulations, to implement those missions. Now, all schemes under the government have long-standing monitoring, review, coordinating, and troubleshooting mechanisms. What exactly is this mechanism? At the state level, every district magistrate in the first week of the month sits with his officers from 9 in the morning to 12 at night, reviewing all the schemes that are under implementation in the district. They are monitored, the problems in implementation are identified, there is banging together of heads, and the whole idea is to ensure that these go forward. The district magistrates then send their reports to the respective state secretaries. And whenever higher level coordination is required, the chief secretaries of the states, they convene a meeting every month and similarly sit from 9 in the morning till way past midnight, coordinating, monitoring, the implementation of these schemes with the state secretaries. What about the central level? We have and of course the chief secretaries, they report to the state cabinet, and the chief secretary often has a review process, in which he reviews the implementation of the schemes along with the concerned ministers. At the central level, we have a similar mechanism comprising of secretaries to the Government of India in different ministries, and they are, they are coordinated by the cabinet secretary, who also reviews the implementation of different schemes under the central government, and they in turn report to the central cabinet, and the Prime Minister takes a review of important schemes periodically. In addition, the NAPCC has a dedicated monitoring mechanism, and this is headed by the Principal Secretary to the PM, and this reports to the PM's Council on Climate Change. Now, of course, you might as well say that, look, these are all laws in respect of individual actions, individual programs, individual missions and so on. But what about an economy-wide law? What about an economy-wide legislation covering the NDCs or the whole economy? Now, we don't have that. And I think that there are two very good reasons why we don't have such a global, all-encompassing legislation. The first is conceptual. India's NDCs represent what may be termed a best effort, non-legally binding commitment under the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement has legally binding commitments for reporting, for MRV, what's called monitoring, review, and verification. But if a particular party, despite the MRV process and the facilitation that is provided under the MRV process, does not accomplish its NDCs, there are no consequences under the Paris Agreement itself, though of course there may be wider consequences, as Ambassador Manjeepuri pointed out. But the NDCs of India are specifically premised and conditional on the provision of finance, of new and additional sources of finance and technology transfer from developed countries. So if these resources are made available by the developed countries through the financial and technology mechanisms under the climate change regime, India can, will then, have a very strong, will not be able to, deny the accomplishment of the NDCs. It will have to fully realize the NDCs. But the point is that none of the NDCs are unconditional. None of the NDCs are, in a sense that to be accomplished solely by Indian resources. Although, of course, the major part of the NDCs and the specific actions on the NDCs are to be accomplished through domestic resources. Now, there's a practical reason as well. Climate change is a whole of the economy issue. And action for climate change, whether in terms of mitigation or adaptation, involves scores of millions of players across all sectors of the economy. The large industries, power plants, steel plants, aluminum plants and so on, but millions and millions of MSMEs, small transport operators, retail shops, retail catering establishments, retail spinning and weaving establishments, a very, very large number of establishments. And if you have an economy-wide target, they must translate down to the level of every single player in the economy. And this will involve target setting, monitoring, and enforcement measures across all these players. Now, to do that, I'm afraid the government does not have the capacity. I do not think any government has the capacity to set up the requisite machinery and to take forward such a very detailed entity by entity target setting, monitoring, and enforcement of such regulations. So therefore, what is practical is what is being done, and that is under, for example, the PAT scheme, which is now to be transmuted into the domestic carbon market, the the number of large units, 500, it was 500 in the first phase, that it's probably increased to 700 now. And this is being done under several missions of the NAPCC. I mentioned PAT, but for example, the energy efficiency standards, they relate to appliances manufactured by major companies, so these are also covered. So the actions are focused on what is feasible, what is practicable, and that is the large sectors. For those, to address those, we have sectoral laws, sectoral regulations, and there is, these can be effectively monitored and enforced. So that is all that I have to say by way of initial remarks. And let me give the floor to my distinguished panelists. The first speaker is Ms. Firishte Setna, Senior Partner, DMD Associates, Mumbai. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. Good evening, everyone. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you, Mr. Moses. Thank you, Nisha. My distinguished co-panelists, friends. I believe Dr. Ghosh pretty much laid out everything there was on matters of the Indian legislative framework insofar as it concerns matters of climate change. I would want to perhaps supplement Dr. Ghosh's views by drawing attention to what I consider to be an umbrella legislation that exists in India, namely the Environment Protection Act 1986 as we know it, which for all intents and purposes has become an all-encompassing catch-all type of legislative framework that ultimately delivers through regulatory mechanisms within the ambit of that framework, every possible arena of industry-related issue, whether it be in relation to mining, whether it be in relation to e-waste, whether it be in relation to solid waste, whether it be in relation to how you will deal with landfills and so on and so forth. So you really do have that wider environment-focused legislative framework in place, independent of, as Dr. Ghosh alluded to, the Forest Conservation Act and the water and the air and so on legislations that we do have in place, which obviously work, no doubt, as efficiently and effectively as does the Environment Protection Act, but no doubt have quite distinct areas that they would effectively be in a position to bring to book parties who were in violation of those statutory mechanisms. So with that overarching position that we do have a legislative framework in place, I would say to you that certainly when it comes to implementation of matters of climate change related legislation specific to matters, again, I want to draw attention to the fact that the Environment Protection Act does have a regulatory framework in relation to, for example, ozone depletion. Very interestingly, we do have a set of rules. They are the 2000 rules, Ozone Depleting Substances Regulation and Control Rules 2000, delivered under the framework and the aegis of the Environment Protection Act. So not just the ozone depletion issues, but you have several ancillary matters as well, including, for instance, the issue of transboundary air pollution matters, which no doubt are captured within the snare of the Air Act, but nevertheless are also within the ambit of the Environment Protection Act, because that, as I started out earlier by saying, is the umbrella legislation. As Dr. Ghosh alluded, and I must say I am in agreement with most of his views, so I will continue to reflect on those as I speak on. The reality is that it is extremely difficult for the government to put into place the type of monitoring mechanism that one would want to have in place in order to ensure that we can deliver on our climate-related goals. But those are goals, they are non-binding, as we know, because that is India's position, a properly reserved position in my respectful submission. and therefore clearly one that we would have to take into account, seeing where the global order shifts in terms of deliverables. And obviously in that context, therefore, the relevance of the North-South divide and how do we effectively, being the global South, begin to address matters concerning climate change overall. As far as commitments are concerned, very clearly, to the extent that we are capable of bringing ourselves within the snare of international protocols and conventions, clearly, to whatever extent we are in a position to contribute, obviously, India has their goals clearly set within the national policy framework. There is no question about the fact that we would have to continue to persevere in those directions, and obviously being the developing country that we are at this point in time, we do have a long way to go in terms of actually achieving, putting into place the mechanisms, and obviously implementation is still a longer way forward. But that said, let's just go back for a moment to the history of the international framework that has preceded the core focused issue that we now grapple with, which is specifically climate change. I just want to go back to 1972, the Stockholm Convention. That is clearly what laid the ground for what would become the catch-all phrase of sustainable development. We had Stockholm, we then had Rio, we had Johannesburg, we had Lima, we've had any number of engagements on the side of sustainable development on the one side, and on the other side we've had climate change related specific conventions, protocols. We've already had multiple speakers allude to them, including the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Pact. So very clearly we are today in a zone where we have identified what needs to be done. The question is, how do we progress toward it? Is there that complete lacunae as a matter of Indian legislation? I would submit that perhaps arguably we do not have the last detail within our Indian legislative framework as far as matters of climate change are concerned in a wider remit. But otherwise, in terms of the overall framework that we have in place today, I do believe that India is well on track to fulfilling what it can reasonably achieve, and very clearly it's a matter of time before we can make the progress that we need to and ensure that we are at level playing field with those countries that may be in a position to effectively get there. But that said, I want to go back to what the previous session spoke to, which is the ability to ensure that we can shape our policies to our requirements. That is crucial, because if we give up our ability to continue to roll out our policy measures to suit our specific requirements, clearly we would be in immense difficulty, because then we would have sanctions imposed upon us, which is certainly not something that India would want to at this juncture prematurely commit to. The question at the end of it is, what is it that we are capable of doing in terms of reducing emission targets? What is it that we can properly legislate in order to ensure that those targets are achievable by our industries and capable of being met? Is that capable of being achieved through imposing taxation consequences, cesses, penalties? What is it that we can do? At this juncture, I believe the government is still grappling with answers. We don't have them yet. As soon as we get to the next level, and I do believe that we're not very far, I think 2050 would be a fair benchmark from what we see in terms of where India is headed. I do believe we will get to legislate in very effective terms by then on matters of climate change. But until then, I think we must await our developments within the country and see how legislation globally as well evolves, because typically we have been taking leaf out of books on matters that are effectively being observed by developed countries, and I'm quite sure that as soon as we get there in terms of achieving our trillion-dollar economy goals are concerned, we too will be in a position to deliver on our climate change obligations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Setna, for your very lucid and cogent presentation. And I now give the floor to Dr. Ninju Thujan Kuiremba Singh. I hope I haven't slaughtered your name.
Yeah.
So, Professor Singh, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for giving such a beautiful introductions and with a beautiful name. Honestly speaking, I am from the academics, and I'm teaching in the Delhi University. I do have a different carry and a different takeaway of the climate change and the climate change regime altogether. Because sitting for the last couple of hours, I was trying to fit myself in the context of the climate regimes where the peoples of the great diplomats and the great peoples are talking about the climates. For me, I do believe in the school which don't believe in the context of the state-centric idea of the international relations, where we believe in the idea of the climatic change falls in the non-state actors and the non-state entities, which cannot resolve the problem through the entities of nation-state system altogether at all. Because starting from my illusionary remarks that Donald Trump can say that I can stop migrations from Mexico by making a wall, but when in the case of global carbon depletions or ozone layer depletions, we cannot make any wall at all. It is a transnational problem. And if you try to solve the problem of the transnational issue through the nation-state system, it will be juxtaposing with its other. So this is the school that I belonged. And the concern that I'm talking about here is like legislations need to be more or less global in nature, and then it should not be confined to the particular nations altogether. In this context, I'm trying to build it up my case studies on the migrations, security impacts, and environmental degradations. And I'm given a very lucid example of northeastern states like Assam and the illegal immigrants, so-called from Bangladesh. This is a case study I'm bringing up, which can bring all together the problems of the environmental degradations or problems of your migration issues can be fixed together and create a kind of amalgamations, legislations which can resolve the problems in the near future. So for example, if you look at it, the problems and the crisis that we have in India, the illegal migrants is very common things, and it's been started from 1970s and 1980s in northeastern regions. And previously, one of the presenters has already put out biohub, noticed as a biohub. It is very politically incorrect to say from my side, because please do not make northeastern regions as the capitalist, view on that, so that it will be exploit like Navi tribes in James Cameron movie Avatar. People are coming and exploit, and people are being used as a matter of non-human things. So please don't use if it is possible. We are also, a lot of people are living over there also in northeastern region, not the biohubs only. And when you look at it, the problem of the human crisis, that when we go back to the theoretical aspect, we are going to go to Copenhagen School, and we are going to non-traditional security threats and international relations, and then we have a lot of human security, like Mehboob ul Haq ideas onto other human security aspects. And lastly, when you talk about the United Nations Development Project, 1994, there are a lot of series of things which talks about humanity. And today, I'm here for the humanity, not for the development. So if you look at it in this process of development process, and this counter effect which happens in the place like northeastern regions and vis-a-vis the other part of the Bangladesh is because of the climatical change. Because the migration which happens in the northeastern region, the heavy influx of the Bangladeshis to the northeastern regions, is because of the climatical change which has been generated by the human being itself, from the Indian side as well as from the other part of the world also. The carbon emissions which has been happened in America leads to the global warming. It's because of that reason there is increase of the sea level. Because of the sea level increase, there is a lot of people are migrating from Bangladesh to India, number one reason. Number two reasons, because of the Farakar Dam, which has been built in between the Bangladesh and in India, it's leading to the flooding of the your land, which is the fertile land of the Bangladeshi, which is also lead to the migrations. Then what actually happened, these migrated peoples are living in the forest state of the northeastern region, especially in Assam. And what actually going to happen over there, you know it. The most of the people who are coming from the Bangladesh, they are surviving in the forest area. They cannot live in mainland areas because they have a lot of issues is going from 1980s, because even xenophobia is there in Assam. Because of that reason, they settle in the dense forest area, and they started cutting the forest very extensively. And I want to draw the attention today that many of the environmental degradations is happening in northeastern regions in present, and it is reality. So for example, Cherrapunji is no more the highest rainfall state in the world right now. It's changed. And today, if you look at it in many states and neighboring states of northeastern regions, there is a drought. That you are talking about the biohub. Today, right now, today, we have a drought situations. Just imagine how this kind of migrations and environmental degradations is in reality. This is what is happens. And I would like to come back again to the real security challenge that India has, because traditional security is all about the killing and the conflict which happens, right? So if you look at in 1995 references or 2005 references, there is a killing of the Muslim community back in Assam. Who are the people who have been killed in Assam? They are the migrants, because of the demographic challenges and the security challenges, which is connected with the demographic imbalances because of the migrations. So if you look at it, the overall conditions which is created by the environmental degradation starting from the northern hemisphere of the world and to the dam building of India, leading to the conflict in India. This is kind of the collateral damages it's happening in India. It can be more potent in the near future, because those people who are being killed in the process of demographic challenges, it can be converted into the terrorist act also, and it can the victim can also convert in terrorism also. So it is a chain of circle of security challenges across. And we never talk about this matter in any forms. For unfortunately, if you look at the refugees laws that we have already conducted and UNHCR, we do have, India is not a signatory even today, we do have a lot of confusions in that area. Plus the migrations and the problem, plus the problem of the environmental degradations which lead to the conflict, we never talk about all this matter. The sustainability is what, for me, is that every human individual live peace and tranquility. So it is not only about creating a dam or creating an innovative program to resolve the problem, but we need to understand the reality of the human security. The security which will make peace as well as sustainable in the near future. So in that way, I would conclude, because we don't have much time. I know that I will not take much time because it is after lunch, post-lunch, this thing. So I would like to bring up to all of the panels that we should think about legislations which try to reconnect the world, as well as those things which are, we think, as a fall apart, try to reconnect with each other, even the security concern, even environmental concern, or concern of the migrations. They are amalgamations of all problems and need to be clearly exemplified and to clearly bring up in the legislations to control the near future problem in the world. Thank you very much.
Singh, for your very interesting views on the genesis of the refugee problem from Bangladesh in the Northeast. I have served in the Northeast and I have some familiarity with this issue. Now, the question of involuntary resettlement owing to climate change and in particular sea level rise is certainly one of the issues that have been flagged in the UNFCCC. But as of now, there is, let's say that there has not been a process to take forward any kind of international burden sharing on the question of climate refugees. So we have climate refugees, arguably people who are climate refugees from different parts of the world, and the starkest example which is cited internationally is that of the migrants from the Sahel, where very huge tracts of fertile grazing and agricultural land have been transformed due to lack of precipitation over several decades into completely arid landscapes. So I think it would behoove the Indian government and research agencies to carefully follow up on your observation that the primary cause of migration into the Northeast from Bangladesh is climate change, is displacement due to climate change. And if we have evidence, that passes muster, if we have data that passes muster, certainly the Indian government would be well placed to then initiate a process in the UNFCCC to arrive at an international discipline on addressing these migrants. The burden of these migrants are now being borne by the local populations, and the resources of the local governments are being actually dissipated in trying to address these issues. It is giving rise to violence, it is giving rise to tension, and I think that this is a very serious political problem that we face, and to the extent that we can persuade the international community that in respect of the refugees from Bangladesh and climate refugees from elsewhere in the world, there must be sharing of living space, sharing of resources to address the resettlement. I think that would be a very important contribution from India. So I would say all power to your elbow, and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
So we have had the presentations from the speakers of this session. The floor is now open for comments and questions. Yes, please. So, yes, please. So kindly identify the panel member to whom the question is addressed.
Yeah, not at all. Thank you very much. Delighted to hear what you all had shared with us. The reason I'm just getting up, I think I need to put two things in perspective. Dr. Singh, I know you must be from Manipur, so from your name I can make out. So you're from Manipur. I was the operational commander there, which looked after Upper Assam, Lower Assam, Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, and Tripura. So I'm very familiar with the dynamics. So some of the figures and statements that you made about climate migrants coming from Bangladesh, I don't think that's a problem that is endemic to the climate change. What happened there, I think the two governments are quite sensitive to it. The armed forces, security forces are sensitive to the problem that exists. There was, let me just put it like this, there were opportunity of work and a lack of workforce in this isolated corner of Northeast, where you had a lot of transition of people coming across from Bangladesh into India as part of a workforce and settling in. The tea gardens themselves, a legacy of our colonial era, allowed this kind of a transmigration that happened. So I think we'll have to be very careful where you identify, are they climate migrants or are they the cause of most of the problems there? No, I don't think so. So I think we'll have to be a little careful on that. I just want to tell you how dynamic is the border between India and Bangladesh. We buy the stone of Meghalaya, which goes into the stone crushers in Bangladesh, and that stone is bought from there back into Manipur and Nagaland and other states. Why is the problem? Our delineation and internecine ethnic domination in areas creates these problems. So I don't think we should blame Bangladesh totally for it. There is a larger challenge to it, and as Dr. Singh, you're going to be doing a research paper on this, please look at it a little more, with a little more critical eye before you come to your conclusions. I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. You might be worked there in the northeastern region. I was born and brought up over there. Because what we are trying to say is that I'm not blaming that it is only Bangladesh's problem that we are facing. What we are trying to say is that from the starting point, non-traditional security is all about the transnational issues we cannot resolve by the one state. Because the contributions of the climatic change and the flooding of your fertile land there and other side, it is also responsible for me, responsible over India. And it is not my research. It was been done by the Ashok Swen, which is working right now in a Copenhagen school, and then he is there in Sweden right now. It is a huge article on that, and if you want to refer, you can go for that also. So in that way, if you look at it, we are trying to say that it is not because of the Bangladeshis who are coming, because I'm blaming to the Bangladesh only. We are trying to say is that even when we talk about the rising of the sea level also, that we are not responsible, even Bangladesh are not responsible. I'm coming back to the real theme of today's topic, global north and the south divides. Whatever the global warming which is happening right now, it is not because of the India or only the Bangladesh. The half of the global warming, or 90% of the global warming, has been generated by the global north. And as if you know it, the emissions which has been, carbon emissions, they have been done, the bomb blast for the arsenal, they had been done so far in the human civilization, they have already depleted our level, and because of that reason, global warming is happening. So what I'm trying to draw attention is that it is not only one or two countries which is impacting to the climate change and which leads to the migrations. It is overall challenge of the world that we are talking about. And if you look at it systematically about the conditions of the Manipur and North Assam especially, if you look at it, the migration is still continuing, because if you know it, if you observe over there, the conditions between the Bangladesh and India is still porous. That we think that there is a huge line in between the Bangladesh and India. It is not like that, because the porousness of the border, if you like, even today you can see it, many of the migrants is still moving on, and we don't have any proper legislations for that even today. So this is what the ground reality in the gray area. I'm not talking about CAA over here. I'm talking about the ground reality which is happening in a grassroots level. Thank you.
No, I totally agree with you. I just wanted to just leave it that please look at it in a more, I would say in a more macro perspective when you make comments on issues that have happened in that area. Yeah. And the reason is I'm still part of the Northeast connectivity. I go there every year. I spent about 14 years in that part of the world. Yeah. So, and I'm still connected. So I'm not, I'm very much to the ground.
Yeah, I think it is nobody's case that there is one single identifiable reason for the migration. That has taken place in a very complex social, economic, environmental milieu. And out of this complex situation, it would need some very rigorous analysis of data to identify what is the extent to which each of the causative factors are contributing to the migration. So I think that certainly it is time that we started a process under the UNFCCC to address this question of involuntary migration. But of course, before India formulates any proposals, we need, I think, further study, and I would actually commend this further study to unequivocally establish that a significant factor in the migration is due to climate change. And of course, Bangladesh and India are not particularly responsible for climate change if you look at the global picture. So, I mean, when it comes to this international discipline, there would have to be the question of, historical responsibility for climate change. That is part of the game. Of course, the current burden sharing regime does not fully or adequately reflect this historical responsibility, but it is a factor which definitely does count. So, can we have some comments and questions from the younger people in the audience? I see a lot of young people, and you're all very very quiet, and I wonder why. No one? No, I think they are debating as to who is.
There's a lady here who would like to ask a question. A lady here.
Yes.
So I'm
Yes.
from another age category. I will use this opportunity to ask the questions. Another one of other reasons of environmental damage which we're having today in the world is modernization itself. So modernization, it means industrialization, and with the industries you are doomed to, you have some consequences, whether in the form of deforestation or some other. So it means that the global south today is on such state of its development that their own industrialization, modernization combines again the backdrop of this more general broad environmental concerns. So what then to do? Whether to abandon this modernization or industrialization projects, or I mean, are we doomed? I mean, global south doomed in this respect? Because in any way, this pace of industrialization inevitably will mean the consequences of environmental problems, issues, particularly for global south. So whether it may come some new technologies, we need to wait for that time, or because this is a sort of contradictory problems which we face now. We cannot allow ourselves not to do industrialization. At the same time, we need to follow the rules of the global environmental degradation. So this is a sort of paradox which we're living in. How do you view this?
Would you like to take this?
I think in all fairness, there has to be a balance to be met. The fact is that we've seen the aftermath, as it were, of what it is that the developed world has effectively brought about in the form of climate change. And we're seeing that with nature in all its fury lashing out week after week, month after month, country after country. So nobody is spared, really. The reality is that if we don't take away lessons from the past, we will be doing ourselves a disservice. Can we stop the clock, however, on development? The answer to that is clearly no. So that is precisely why, when we trace back the history of the last 50 years, as I started out earlier by saying, Stockholm laid down sustainable development. And sustainable development, no doubt, has not been duly honored by the developed world. But the question that we must grapple with today is the global south going to take away from what it is that has transpired in the past and improvise and use the benefit of technology and use the benefit of all of the advancements, the modernizations, as you put it, to effectively ensure that we don't go beyond what should be reasonable limitations in terms of delivering up for the next level of development. That's how I see it. And I do believe that at the end of the day, it is very clear that the international conventions have not done their job. They clearly haven't. Because there's a lot of talk, there's no implementation, and that has been the gripe of the developing world for sure. So the question is, how do you redress that? Is there a means by bringing about regional cooperation? Is there a means by bringing about bilateral negotiations and ensuring implementation, at the minimum among neighboring states? What is the solution? There is really no clear line of sight on that. But at the end of the day, I would think that we have to aim as responsible global citizenry to strike a balance.
I just want to give you a few examples that makes me a little bit counter narratives about the questions that you have raised. So for example, if you look at it, the global note has already stopped, and the European Union has already sanctions against the making of the dam in the European countries. But unfortunately, they are spending a lot of money and investing in a country like India even today, number one. And number two, in the name of the productions, in the name of the mass productions, and in the name of the doubling of the productions, we are using GMOs. You know what is the GMOs? Genetically modified. Yes? Because of that reason, thousands of people in India are dying because of the modernizations. Because of that reason, let me tell you, 80,000 people are being suicide in India. They are farmers because of the GMOs, because in the name of development and civilizations and sustainability. So in that way, we just want to say that we don't care about the development and non-development, but the Northern Hemisphere to understand the ethicality and the problem that we are facing. So it is a time to bridge the gap between the North and South about this problem. And do not blame everything because of using tuk-tuk in India is creating carbon emissions. It is the problem of the environmental degradation is global, and we have to think from the both sides, North as well as the South. Sensibility is very much required. As I have already told you, that ozone layer depletions cannot be solved by making a seal of, something in India only, or America only, or Kazakhstan only. We need to take up it as a global problem. Sensibility is very much required. That is what I want to say. Thank you very much.
Well, let me just address this very difficult question, very complex question. You see, the global climate change regime has hugely complicated the task of developing countries to raise living standards and to eradicate poverty. And this is primarily because if developing countries are pushed to taking commitments for greenhouse gas mitigation, which is out of proportion to their relative contributions to the concentration of GHGs in the atmosphere, a very large proportion of the investment available for development expenditure, roads, highways, railways, power plants, schools, hospitals, would have to be diverted to either retrofitting or greenfield investment, which is much more expensive than the conventional technologies. To give you an illustration, 1 megawatt of capacity of a solar power plant costs $1 billion. So does a 1,000 megawatt plant of a coal-fired power plant. It costs $1 billion. But the coal-fired power plant operates at a plant load factor of 80%. The solar plant at best of times operates at a plant load factor of 20%, which means to generate the same quantity of electricity, You need 4 times the investment in the solar power plant as compared to the coal-fired power plant. But that is not all. The coal-fired plant gives you electricity steadily, and to a very large extent, it can follow changes in demand. The solar power plant cannot do that. So you need additional investments either in storage or in peaking power, which remains idle most of the time. And so what happens is that it increases your investments, it increases your cost of energy. And energy goes into everything in every form of production and in many forms of consumption as well. So in Terry, where I work now, we have done several modeling studies of how much actually it would cost. And to attain net zero by 2050, I mean, this study was done before India made its Glasgow announcement, it would cost $133 trillion between now and 2050 to get to net zero. But we will not quite get to net zero. And this is in addition to the investment that we have to make for adaptation. And right now, I think it may surprise the participants to know that what we spend on addressing climate risks in this country exceeds the total amount that we spend each year on national defense. So we are talking of a huge, huge diversion of resources which would otherwise have gone for development investment into addressing climate change. Of course, there is new technology, and I think, Madam Setna spoke about the lack of progress in implementation or lack of movement in the UNFCCC on the climate change negotiations. I would actually have a little quibble with that, because it is true that the negotiations proceed glacially. But if we look at the technologies that have emerged and are being deployed on a massive scale, last year, globally, the total amount of investment on renewable power generation exceeded that of conventional power generation. And it has been so for several years. In India, we have set ourselves a target of 500 gigawatts of power from renewables by 2030. This translates into some $800 billion of investment, additional investment. And at the end of it, if we realize this goal, 50% of our total power will come from renewables. And this is a far cry from what it was, the situation 10, 20 or 30 years ago. If we look at means of transportation, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, I mean, electricity-based transportation was confined to trains and to metro systems and so on. But now, increasingly, I mean, for example, in the major cities, we have taxi services which run entirely on electricity. So if you look at the landscape, there are many, many technologies which have developed and which have come on stream, but they come at a cost. So I would submit that the problem, I don't think we are doomed, but I do think that we face very, very difficult choices in our policy making and in our development strategy. And this is true not only for India, this is true for the Central Asian states, this is true for other developing countries as well. So, do we have some more comments or questions? So if none, I think we would now close the session. So thank you all. I would like to thank our speakers for this session and there's a student there? Yes, please. Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is directed towards Ms. Farishte Setna. So after you delivered your talk, this question came into my mind. You talked about the framework that is there, like from the grassroots level, how the laws are being made and the message gets transferred to the PM PM's counsel to the PM. So, and you also, or you already, later on, you already said that there's a problem in implementation. And that was also the point that came into my mind, that despite the laws being in place, how do we ensure that like these are being implemented to maximum, in order to achieve maximum effectiveness?
Well, I believe that the answer to that question is a difficult one. It obviously requires a different level of, for the large part, I think, corporate responsibility. Because what we have to allow for is that there is a significant distance between laws and how they are actually observed on the ground. And to bridge that, you do require a significantly wider remit of monitoring agencies, and you have to have a system that is capable of bringing violators to book. The sooner you can do that, which is something that we today certainly have a significant lack of, because we have several problems in this country, including the ability to deliver swift justice. So until that problem prevails very clearly, and until the monitoring agencies are not doing their job, we will be where we are. But otherwise, the laws do exist, is the point I'm making. And implementation is really the scope of responsibility and the remit of responsibility of the individual, who is the person behind the corporate, no doubt, and the corporate body itself as the institution that is required to observe the laws of the country. So until we have inculcated that sense of responsibility, and I do believe that that sense of responsibility can come from myriad bases, including not just educating the next generation in terms of abiding by the rule book, as it were, but also through imposition of penalties, stiff penalties, which would ultimately perhaps set the stage for ensuring that in future, with those kinds of judicial or other precedents set, there would be scope for implementation going forward. I hope that answers your question.
So thank you, Madam Setna, and I think with that we have to close the session. So let me close by thanking our speakers for their very interesting, thought-provoking presentations, and also for their very careful and and thoughtful responses to the questions from the participants. So with that, I think we will close the session.
Thank you for a wonderful session, the last of the conference today. Now the presentations will be made to the speakers of this session. Thank you, Dr. Ghosh, Ms. Setna, and Dr. Singh.
Thank you.
With this, our conference concludes. We invite all of you to stay back for tea. We thank you for being present here. You've been a wonderful audience.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Doctor. It was very good. Thank you, Mr. Singh. Thank you.